September 25, 1959. Camp David, Maryland. The most powerful man in the Soviet Union sits across from the President of the United States. Nikita Khrushchev is confident, even cocky. He spent days touring America, lecturing Americans about the superiority of communism, throwing tantrums when things don't go his way. Now he's demanding concessions on Berlin. He thinks Dwight Eisenhower, the smiling grandfather who paints landscapes on weekends, will fold. He has no idea that the man facing him learned how to handle bullies from George Patton, the most aggressive, audacious general America ever produced. And what Patton taught Eisenhower during World War II is about to save the world from nuclear war. Because sometimes the lessons we learn from difficult people turn out to be the most valuable ones. To understand how a friendship forged in the fires of World War II would shape the Cold War, you need to know three things. First, in 1919, two young Army officers became friends at Camp Meade, Maryland. Dwight Eisenhower was nobody special, a middle-class kid from Kansas who'd never seen combat. George Patton was American aristocracy, wealthy, connected, and already a war hero with a chest full of medals from France. They bonded over a shared obsession with tanks and spent their days tinkering with machinery, writing tactical papers that nobody wanted to read, and dreaming about the future of warfare. Second, their friendship survived 2 decades of military life until history flipped their roles upside down. In 1942, Eisenhower became Supreme Commander, while Patton, older and more experienced, became his subordinate. Eisenhower had never commanded troops in battle. Patton had been leading men since 1916. But Eisenhower had what the army needed, more than battlefield brilliance. He could make allies work together, and in a coalition war against Hitler, that mattered more than tactical genius. Third, their relationship was never easy. Patton was profane, impulsive, and convinced he was a reincarnated warrior from ancient Rome. Eisenhower was diplomatic, measured, and determined to be liked. Patton constantly pushed boundaries, said outrageous things to the press, and treated Eisenhower's orders as suggestions. Yet Eisenhower kept him because Patton could do things no other general could do. He moved armies faster, hit harder, and scared the Germans more than anyone else in the Allied forces. Now, with that in mind, let's talk about what happened when these two very different men tried to win a war together. December 19, 1944, Verdun, France. The Germans had just launched their massive Ardennes offensive, and American forces were reeling. Eisenhower called an emergency meeting. Every senior commander showed up looking grim. Then Patton walked in. While everyone else was talking about defensive positions and strategic withdrawals, Patton was grinning. In his high-pitched voice that didn't match his tough guy image, he shouted, "This bastard has put his cock in a meat grinder, and I've got a hold of the handle." Everyone laughed, but more importantly, everyone relaxed. That was Patton's gift. He could walk into a room full of defeated men and make them believe they were about to win. Eisenhower asked Patton how soon he could counterattack. Every other general in the room knew this was nearly impossible. Patton's Third Army was fighting in a completely different direction, 100 miles south. To counterattack, he'd have to pull his entire army out of battle, turn 90 degrees and march through winter storms. Patton answered immediately. 3 divisions in 2 days. Eisenhower didn't believe him. Nobody did. But Patton had already thought it through. That morning, before the meeting, he'd left 3 different contingency plans with his staff, each with a code word. All he had to do was call and give the order. 3 days later, on December 22nd, Patton's forces were attacking north. By December 26th, they'd broken through to Bastogne and relieved the surrounded 101st Airborne. It was one of the most remarkable military maneuvers in American history, and it taught Eisenhower something crucial. Audacity works. When everyone expects you to retreat, attack instead. But Patton taught Eisenhower other lessons too, some of them harder. In August 1943, at the height of the Sicily campaign, Patton slapped 2 soldiers suffering from battle fatigue, calling them cowards. When Eisenhower found out, he was furious, not just because it was wrong, but because it threatened the entire command structure. The press would crucify Patton. Congress would demand his removal. The British, who already mistrusted aggressive American generals, would use it as proof that Americans couldn't be trusted with important commands. Eisenhower had every reason to fire Patton. He should have fired Patton. But he didn't. Instead, He made Patton apologize, kept the story quiet for as long as possible, and when it finally leaked, Eisenhower defended him just enough to save his career. Why? Because Eisenhower understood something about power that would serve him well later. Sometimes you need a difficult person, precisely because they're difficult. Patton scared the Germans. After Sicily, German intelligence spent months tracking where Patton was, assuming he'd lead the invasion of France. When D-Day came, the deception worked partly because the Germans couldn't believe the Allies would waste Patton on a diversionary role. Eisenhower had learned to manage a volatile asset, to contain the damage while extracting the value. That skill, learned through years of handling Patton's outbursts and impulsiveness, would prove essential when facing another volatile personality 14 years later. Because Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet premier who banged his shoe at the United Nations and threatened to bury the West, was about to discover that the smiling American president was much tougher than he looked. When Dwight Eisenhower became president in January 1953, he inherited a world that looked remarkably like the one he'd left in 1945. Europe was divided. Armies faced each other across hostile borders. The difference now was that both sides had nuclear weapons, and the slightest miscalculation could end civilization. Joseph Stalin, the Soviet dictator Eisenhower had dealt with during the war, died 2 months after Eisenhower took office. His successor, Nikita Khrushchev, was a different animal entirely. Stalin had been calculating and paranoid, but predictable in his brutality. Khrushchev was impulsive, emotional, and prone to dramatic gestures. He gave speeches denouncing Stalin's crimes, promised peace and prosperity, then threatened nuclear war when he didn't get his way. He was, in many ways, the Soviet version of George Patton, except he controlled an empire and thousands of nuclear warheads. Eisenhower's initial response was everything Patton had taught him not to do. He tried diplomacy. In April 1953, just weeks into his presidency, he gave his Chance for Peace speech, offering cooperation and disarmament if the Soviets would free Eastern Europe and allow German reunification. The speech was eloquent and well received in the West. The Soviets ignored it completely. Then in 1955, Eisenhower proposed his Open Skies plan at the Geneva summit, suggesting that the US and Soviet Union allow mutual aerial surveillance to prevent surprise attacks and build trust. Khrushchev rejected it instantly, calling it an espionage scheme. The Soviet leader was testing Eisenhower, probing for weakness, exactly like Hitler had tested the Allies before the war. In October 1957, the Soviets launched Sputnik, the first artificial satellite. It wasn't just a scientific achievement, it was a message. If Soviet rockets could reach space, they could reach American cities. Khrushchev boasted openly about Soviet missile superiority, claiming the USSR was producing rockets like sausages. American intelligence couldn't verify or disprove these claims. The United States seemed to be falling behind in the arms race, and more importantly, Eisenhower seemed to be letting it happen. Then in November 1958, Khrushchev issued his Berlin ultimatum. West Berlin, a democratic island deep inside communist East Germany, was a problem for the Soviets. Every month, thousands of East Germans fled to freedom through Berlin. It was embarrassing and economically devastating. Khrushchev demanded that the Western Allies leave Berlin within 6 months, or he'd sign a separate peace treaty with East Germany, effectively cutting off Allied access to the city. If the West tried to maintain their presence by force, it would mean war, nuclear war. Eisenhower's advisors were divided. Some wanted to call Khrushchev's bluff immediately, to send massive reinforcements to Berlin and dare the Soviets to start World War III. Others wanted to negotiate, to find some face-saving compromise that would defuse the crisis without appearing weak. The problem was that both options had failed before. In 1938, Britain and France had tried negotiation at Munich, and Hitler had taken it as permission to grab whatever he wanted. In 1939, they'd drawn a hard line on Poland, and Hitler had called their bluff, starting the war anyway. Eisenhower had lived through both failures. He'd seen how weakness invited aggression and how rigid ultimatums eliminated room for maneuver. He needed a third way, and he found it in the lessons Patton had beaten into him over years of shared command. The situation grew more dangerous in 1959. In June, Khrushchev renewed his Berlin threats, this time more aggressively. In July, he visited Poland and East Germany, giving speeches that whipped up anti-American sentiment. Soviet propaganda portrayed Eisenhower as a warmonger, preparing to attack the peaceful Soviet Union. Western intelligence reported increased Soviet military activity near Berlin. Some analysts believed Khrushchev was serious, that he genuinely intended to force the West out of Berlin and was willing to risk war to do it. Others thought it was theater, that Khrushchev was playing to domestic audiences and would back down if confronted. Eisenhower, who had spent years decoding Patton's posturing and determining when his threats were real, wasn't sure which Khrushchev he was dealing with. But he knew he couldn't afford to guess wrong. The stakes were infinitely higher than they'd ever been in the war against Germany. This time, miscalculation meant nuclear holocaust. And that's when Eisenhower did something unexpected, something that confused his own advisors and alarmed his allies. In July 1959, he invited Khrushchev to visit the United States. The decision to invite Khrushchev shocked almost everyone. British Prime Minister Harold Macmillan was alarmed. French President Charles de Gaulle was offended that he hadn't been consulted. In Washington, hardline anti-communists accused Eisenhower of appeasement, of repeating Neville Chamberlain's mistake at Munich. Even within Eisenhower's own administration, Secretary of State John Foster Dulles had serious doubts. The invitation seemed to validate Soviet behavior, to reward Khrushchev's threats with the prestige of a state visit. But Eisenhower understood something his critics didn't. He'd learned it from managing Patton. When dealing with someone whose behavior is driven by ego and insecurity, sometimes the best move is to give them what they want, but on your terms, in your territory, where you control the environment. This was classic Patton psychology, but inverted. Patton had taught Eisenhower that aggressive personalities respond to shows of confidence, not submission. When Patton had pushed boundaries during the war, Eisenhower's most effective response had never been to match Patton's aggression with his own anger. That just escalated the conflict. Instead, Eisenhower would remain calm, acknowledge Patton's concerns, but make it absolutely clear that certain lines would not be crossed. He'd give Patton freedom to operate in his own way, but within defined parameters. Step outside those parameters, and the consequences would be immediate and decisive. Eisenhower applied the same framework to Khrushchev. The invitation to visit America wasn't appeasement. It was a test. Khrushchev would come to America as a guest, which meant he'd have to behave like a guest. He'd see American prosperity, American military power, and American confidence up close. More importantly, Eisenhower would get to take Khrushchev's measure face to face, to understand whether he was actually dangerous or just loud. And if Khrushchev thought this meant Eisenhower was weak, well, Eisenhower had dealt with that misconception before. September 15, 1959. Khrushchev arrived in Washington for a 13-day tour of the United States. From the beginning, the Soviet leader acted exactly as Eisenhower expected. He was boastful, demanding, and quick to take offense. In Los Angeles, he became furious when security concerns prevented him from visiting Disneyland, claiming it was a deliberate insult. He lectured Hollywood executives about the superiority of Soviet cinema, comparing American films to pornography. At a dinner in San Francisco, he threatened the city with nuclear destruction if war came, then complained that Americans were too sensitive when people objected. To observers, it looked like disaster. The American press portrayed Khrushchev as crude and threatening. The British worried that Eisenhower had made a terrible mistake. But Eisenhower was watching carefully, and he was learning exactly what Patton would have told him to look for. Khrushchev's outbursts weren't signs of strength. They were signs of insecurity. When people are genuinely confident in their power, they don't need to constantly remind everyone how powerful they are. On September 25th, Eisenhower brought Khrushchev to Camp David for private talks. This was the moment that mattered. No press, no advisors running in and out. Just the two leaders, their translators, and time to talk. Eisenhower chose the setting deliberately. Camp David was intimate, informal, the opposite of the intimidating grandeur of the Kremlin. He wanted Khrushchev relaxed, off balance, comfortable enough to speak freely but aware that he was in Eisenhower's world now. The next day, Eisenhower took another page from the Patton playbook. He invited Khrushchev to his farm in Gettysburg. This was personal territory, the only home Eisenhower had ever owned. He showed Khrushchev his prize Angus cattle, his oil paintings, the glassed-in porch where he and Mamie played cards. He was doing exactly what he'd done with difficult Allied generals during the war, letting them see him as a human being rather than just a commander, building a personal connection that made confrontation more complicated. But he was also sending a message. This American president, who painted landscapes and raised cattle, had commanded the largest military coalition in history. He'd beaten the Wehrmacht. He'd rebuilt Western Europe. The fact that he seemed gentle and grandfatherly didn't mean he was weak. Patton had taught him that lesson by being its opposite. Patton had projected aggression so effectively that people forgot he was also a brilliant historian who spoke French fluently and wrote poetry. The performance mattered, but so did the substance beneath it. Over 2 days at Camp David and Gettysburg, Eisenhower and Khrushchev talked about everything: nuclear weapons, Germany, Berlin, trade, space. The conversation wasn't about reaching final agreements. It was about establishing understanding. Eisenhower made his position on Berlin crystal clear. The United States would not abandon West Berlin. That was non-negotiable. But he also indicated flexibility on other issues. Perhaps there could be negotiations about Germany's future. Perhaps cultural exchanges and trade could reduce tensions. The key was that both sides had to feel secure, and security wasn't achieved through threats. This was another Patton lesson, though Patton had never articulated it so diplomatically. When Patton fought, he hit hard and fast, but he also gave the enemy a way out. At Bastogne, he broke the encirclement so decisively that trapped German units could retreat or surrender, rather than fight to the death. He understood that people fight harder when they have no choice, so he usually gave them a choice, just not a good one. Eisenhower was offering Khrushchev the same thing: backing down on Berlin without nuclear war or nuclear war. Choose. When Khrushchev left America on September 27th, the Berlin crisis hadn't been resolved. The fundamental disagreement remained. But the temperature had dropped. Khrushchev withdrew his 6-month deadline. He agreed to continue negotiations. Most importantly, both leaders had established a personal relationship and a communication channel. They understood each other's red lines. This was Eisenhower's greatest victory in the Cold War, though it didn't look like one at the time. He hadn't forced a Soviet surrender. He hadn't made Khrushchev back down publicly. But he'd done something more important. He'd taken the most dangerous confrontation since the Korean War and defused it without firing a shot, without giving up any vital interests, and without humiliating the other side so badly that they'd have to escalate to save face. That was the supreme skill Eisenhower had learned from managing Patton. Victory didn't always mean crushing the opponent. Sometimes victory meant finding a way to let the opponent retreat with dignity, so they didn't feel compelled to do something suicidally reckless. The months following Khrushchev's visit proved that the lessons had worked. The spirit of Camp David, as it became known, changed the tone of the Cold War. Khrushchev stopped threatening immediate action on Berlin. Eisenhower agreed to a four-powers summit in Paris for May 1960 to discuss outstanding issues. Both sides began cultural and scientific exchanges. American musicians toured the Soviet Union. Soviet scientists visited American universities. It wasn't peace, but it was something short of war, which in the nuclear age counted as success. But then on May 1st, 1960, 2 weeks before the Paris summit, disaster struck. A US U-2 spy plane was shot down over the Soviet Union. The pilot, Francis Gary Powers, was captured alive. And Eisenhower made a decision that seemed to contradict everything he'd learned from Patton. He told the truth. The initial American response was the standard Cold War lie. The State Department claimed the aircraft was a weather research plane that had strayed off course. The Soviets knew better. They had the wreckage, they had the pilot. They had photographs of Soviet military installations taken from the aircraft. Khrushchev waited 3 days, letting the Americans dig themselves deeper into the lie, then revealed everything in a public speech to the Supreme Soviet. He called Eisenhower a liar and demanded an apology. Most of Eisenhower's advisors wanted to maintain the cover story, to deny everything despite the evidence, to claim Powers had gone rogue or the plane had been stolen. This was the Cold War playbook. Never admit, never apologize, never show weakness. But Eisenhower overruled them all. On May 11th, he went on television and admitted the truth. Yes, the U-2 had been spying on the Soviet Union. Yes, he had authorized the flights. Yes, they'd been going on for years. And no, he would not apologize, because the United States had a right to verify Soviet military capabilities to prevent a surprise attack. The decision shocked the world. American presidents didn't admit to espionage. They certainly didn't take personal responsibility for it. But Eisenhower understood something his critics didn't, something he'd learned from watching Patton. When you're caught, lying makes it worse. Patton had been terrible at lying. When he made a mistake, everyone knew immediately because he'd try to justify it with increasingly ridiculous stories. The slapping incident became a disaster, not because Patton hit the soldiers, but because he tried to defend it as justified discipline. Eisenhower had learned to cut his losses, admit the mistake, explain the reasoning, and move on. They'd robbed the opponent of the satisfaction of exposing you. More importantly, it established that you were strong enough to take responsibility. Weak people lie. Strong people admit what they did and dare anyone to do something about it. Khrushchev wasn't prepared for this response. He'd expected denials, which would have given him the moral high ground and justification for his threats. Instead, Eisenhower had essentially said, "Yes, we've been spying on you. We're going to keep spying on you. Deal with it." When the Paris summit convened on May 16th, Khrushchev tried to salvage the situation by demanding an apology, a promise to end all reconnaissance flights, and punishment for those responsible. Eisenhower refused. He suspended the U-2 flights for the duration of his presidency as a practical matter, since they were now too vulnerable to Soviet missiles. But he wouldn't apologize for protecting American security. The summit collapsed. Khrushchev stormed out in a theatrical rage. The spirit of Camp David was dead. Critics accused Eisenhower of destroying years of progress through stubbornness. But Eisenhower understood something they didn't. If he'd apologized, if he'd shown weakness, Khrushchev would have pressed for more concessions. On Berlin, on Germany, on everything. That's what bullies do when you show weakness, and Patton had taught Eisenhower that you never show weakness to a bully, even when you've made a mistake. The real test came in the final months of Eisenhower's presidency. Khrushchev, humiliated by the U-2 incident and the failed Paris summit, needed to look strong for domestic audiences. He began making new threats about Berlin, suggesting he might close access routes or force a confrontation. Some of Eisenhower's advisors wanted to send additional troops to Germany to match Soviet threats with American threats. Others wanted to try another summit to give Khrushchev a way to back down gracefully. Eisenhower did neither. Instead, he did exactly what he'd done dozens of times when managing Patton during the war. He made it clear that the U.S. position hadn't changed, that Berlin wasn't negotiable, that American forces would defend their rights by force if necessary. Then he went quiet. No threats, no ultimatums, no dramatic speeches. Just calm, immovable certainty that the United States would do what it said it would do. This was the final Patton lesson, the one that had taken Eisenhower years to fully understand. Patton's aggression, his dramatic speeches and theatrical gestures had all been in service of one fundamental principle. Be absolutely certain of what you're willing to do, make that certainty visible to the enemy, and then let them decide whether to test you. Patton had been willing to die in battle, and he'd made that willingness so obvious that it shaped enemy calculations. Eisenhower was willing to risk nuclear war over Berlin, and he needed Khrushchev to believe that without actually starting a war. Eisenhower left office in January 1961 without resolving the Berlin crisis. That task would fall to John F. Kennedy, who lacked Eisenhower's experience managing difficult personalities and would pay for it at the Vienna summit later that year. 6 months later, the Soviets built the Berlin Wall. 18 months after that, they put nuclear missiles in Cuba, leading to the world's closest brush with nuclear war. Kennedy met with Khrushchev and came away shaken. The Soviet leader had bullied him, threatened him, and walked away convinced the young president was weak. But Eisenhower's lessons weren't lost. Kennedy's resolution during the Cuban Missile Crisis, his willingness to go to the brink while still offering Khrushchev a face-saving compromise, followed exactly the template Eisenhower had established. Stand firm on non-negotiable interests. Project absolute confidence in your willingness to fight, but always give the other side a way out that doesn't require them to admit total defeat. Because defeated enemies with nothing to lose will take desperate gambles. And in the nuclear age, desperate gambles meant species extinction. The relationship between Eisenhower and Patton had been complicated, often frustrating and occasionally bitter. When Patton died in December 1945, Eisenhower grieved genuinely, but also felt relief. Managing Patton had been exhausting. The constant need to control his outbursts, defend his actions, and prevent his self-destructive tendencies from derailing the war effort had consumed enormous energy. But in retrospect, Eisenhower came to see those difficult years as essential preparation for the Cold War presidency. No other American military leader would have been as effective as Eisenhower in dealing with Khrushchev, precisely because no other American military leader had spent years managing someone like Patton. The skills were directly transferable. Read the person behind the performance. Distinguish between real threats and theater. Give volatile personalities room to maneuver while maintaining firm boundaries. Never escalate unnecessarily, but never back down from a genuine test. And most important, understand that the strongest move is often the one that looks like weakness to people who don't understand the game. The irony is that Patton would have hated Eisenhower's approach to Khrushchev. Patton had spent his final months in Germany arguing that the United States should attack the Soviet Union immediately, while American forces were still mobilized and the Soviets were exhausted from defeating Hitler. He saw Stalin as another Hitler, a dictator who only understood force, and he believed that accommodating the Soviets would lead to the same disaster as accommodating Hitler had led to in the 1930s. Patton was probably right that confronting Soviet expansion earlier would have been easier than confronting it later. But he was wrong that force was the only option. Patton understood war. Eisenhower understood something harder: how to win without fighting, how to project power without using it, and how to defeat an enemy by making them defeat themselves. Those lessons didn't come from military academies or strategic studies. They came from the messy, frustrating, exhausting experience of dealing with George S. Patton Jr. for 5 years of war. And when Eisenhower needed them most, when the stakes were higher than they'd ever been in human history, those lessons turned out to be exactly what the world needed. Because the skills required to manage Patton without breaking him turned out to be surprisingly similar to the skills required to manage Khrushchev without ending the world. Here's the question nobody asked at the time but should have. What if Eisenhower had never served with Patton? What if he'd spent World War II in a comfortable posting, managing logistics from London, never having to deal with a subordinate who was constantly creating crises that threatened to destabilize the entire Allied coalition? Would he have handled Khrushchev differently? Almost certainly yes. He would have been more rigid, more likely to see situations in black and white, more inclined to escalate confrontations rather than manage them. The Berlin crisis might have turned hot. The U-2 incident could have led to war. The world survived the 1950s partly because the American president had learned through painful experience that the most dangerous people are often the most valuable ones if you know how to channel their energy without being consumed by their chaos. That's a lesson with implications far beyond the Cold War. In any organization, in any relationship, the difficult personalities are usually difficult for a reason. They see things others don't. They're willing to take risks others won't. They push boundaries because they intuitively understand that boundaries need to be pushed sometimes. The question isn't whether to tolerate difficult people. The question is how to work with them in ways that extract their value while minimizing the damage they can do. Eisenhower never wrote this down directly, but his actions speak clearly. Learn from people who are nothing like you. The skills you develop managing difficult relationships will serve you in ways you can't predict. Strength and flexibility aren't opposites. Sometimes the strongest move is giving the other person room to retreat. And, most important, never forget that the person making the most noise isn't necessarily the most dangerous. Sometimes they're just scared, and scared people can be managed if you understand what they're really afraid of. Patton was afraid of being thought a coward. Khrushchev was afraid of looking weak to his own people. Once Eisenhower understood those fears, he could work with them, around them, and sometimes through them. That's not the kind of wisdom you learn from textbooks. You learn it from living through 5 years of George Patton, creating problems that somehow turned into victories, and then applying those hard-won insights to prevent nuclear war. Not a bad return on investment for friendship with a difficult man. The friendship between Eisenhower and Patton shaped world history in ways neither man could have imagined. If you want to understand more about how personal relationships between leaders influence global events, I've got another video about Churchill and Roosevelt's complicated alliance during World War II that you'll find fascinating. The subscribe button is right there, and hitting it helps this channel continue exploring the human stories behind historical turning points. Because history isn't just about nations and ideologies, it's about people, their relationships, and the lessons they teach each other, sometimes without even realizing it. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.